But today's class is bringing us very much into modern archaeology, taking us to another entirely different part of the world, one we've not looked at before, and that's the modern Republic of China. What you have to bear in mind as the background information for this class is that until the 2nd century or the 3rd century BC, what we know as the Republic of China simply did not exist. It was a region divided up into several kingdoms, roughly 6 or 7 different kingdoms, united in one sense in that they all spoke one or other type of Chinese language. I'll come back to that a bit later. But everything began to change in the year 230 BC when this man here, Ying Zheng, who's the king of Qi or Qin, Xian, started a series of campaigns to take control over the other territories. This was a process that took him down to 221 BC, by which time he had absolute control of all these areas where a form of the Chinese language was spoken. He unites all these territories under one ruler, the Empire of Qin, and he himself changed his name to Qin Shi Huangdi. There are different ways of spelling this, of course, but it all means the same, first emperor of Qin. Well, to modern Chinese historians, he's a bit of a controversial figure in many ways. There are several good things that he did. There are also some pretty nasty, horrible things he did as well. So, for example, what modern Chinese historians are grateful to him for is, for example, creating a unified system of weights and measures throughout the entire Empire of Qin. This is an inscription on a bronze tablet which records in a series of 40 or so characters this new law he brought in. I think it was about 213 or something like that, stipulating that all the regions in the empire had to use the same standard set of weights and measures. Well, this obviously makes life a lot easier if everybody's using the same weights and measures, and there were a series of official weighing sets like this that were given out, and also measuring bowls of the same type as well. It's part of a process of unifying all these people into one recognizable empire. He also introduced a standardized currency system, monetary system. Up to this time, the different regions of what we would call China had their own particular types of currency. Some of them were in rather strange shapes, like a spade or like a razor like this. What the first emperor did was to introduce a standard coin, or rather 2 standard coins, one gold, one bronze, known as a banliang qian. Banliang means half a liang. A liang is a unit of weight. It's roughly about 6 grams or so. So now all of the empire has got a unified currency system. It makes finance and trade a lot easier as well. But this coin has also got a symbolic message. It's got a political statement behind it. In Chinese symbolism, the earth is thought of as being square. That's why you have the square hole in the center of the coin. The heavens are thought of as being around the earth in a circular shape. But the circle is also a sign of flexibility and change, something like that. The square is a symbol of strength. So you can see the coin as symbolizing the emperor bringing stability in a world of change, but also the emperor at the center of the heavens. So the square sign representing the earth there. So that wherever the coin went, it takes that political message with it. The first emperor unifying China, creating a single state. The new emperor's reforms, or the first emperor's reforms, went even further. He established a standard width for all carts and carriages. Every wagon drawn by an animal had to be 6 qi wide. What's that, you all said? 1.44 meters roughly. And he brought in a law that all the roads had to be at least twice that width, so that two carts could go past each other in opposite directions. Well, obviously this is to help make trade a lot better, but the roads have got a military purpose. They allow his army to go wherever he wants them very quickly. The first emperor is very conscious of the fact he controls, in theory, a very large area of territory. There's potential for rebellions in the old kingdoms. And so he establishes 7 major highways, which are 70 meters wide, so that his army can get from one major trouble spot to another as fast as possible. And this is one of his roads going from Xian. The longest of his roads is 900 kilometers long, which is really quite something. In addition to this, the first emperor is very conscious of the fact that China is threatened from outside by all these Turkic-speaking peoples in Asia. He builds the first Great Wall of China. This is the Great Wall of China in the Qin period, as you can see, enclosing the heartland of the Qin Empire, hopefully to prevent all these Turkic-speaking attackers from staying outside. In its latest form, of course, it's a very elaborate structure like this, with a series of watchtowers at various locations along it. To modern Chinese eyes, though, the most significant reform was the one he brought in round about 210 BC. He introduced a standard script for the whole of the Empire of Qin. It's known as Qiaozhan, or small seal script. Now, one thing that you are probably completely unaware of is that a person from Peking speaks an entirely different form of Chinese from a person from Hong Kong, who speaks a different form of Chinese from a person in Xian. These are major differences. It's all Chinese, yes. These are major differences. And, you know, I can assure you this is true because my nephew worked in Hong Kong for several years, and he married a girl from Hong Kong. And he introduced me to the joke I always use about, you know, sort of, why don't I speak Turkish? So I don't have any arguments with my mother-in-law. She doesn't speak English, you see. And my nephew introduced me to that idea. I think it's a lovely one. But although you've got these different varieties of Chinese, what the first emperor did was to introduce a standard script that everybody could read. So whether you are Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese Chinese, Qian Chinese, that symbol means exactly the same word, although it sounds very differently. What a big surprise, eh? So any of you thinking of learning Chinese, bear that in mind. You don't want to learn Cantonese spoken in Hong Kong because it's not much use if you go to Peking, or Beijing as we should call it now. So these are some very significant reforms that the first emperor brought into practice in creating the first empire of Qin. But on the other hand, the first emperor also did some pretty nasty things in many ways. For example, 213 BC, he orders the burning of the books. He orders the destruction of all the existing written histories. And when some scholars, some Confucian scholars, object to this, because he also orders the destruction of works on philosophy, he has them buried alive, which is what we see here. The burning of the books and the burying alive of the Confucian scholars. Why does he do this? Well, he doesn't want the potential of anybody bringing in alternative ideas. This is of course, a matter of great regret for Chinese historians today, because there are no written records from the time before the first emperor. They existed, but they were all destroyed. On the other hand, it sets a precedent, it sets an example And as you're probably aware, the modern Chinese government is very happy and very good at keeping information down whenever it can, especially with the internet. So this particular idea is not exactly a new one. It goes back a long way. The burning of the books, the burial of Confucian scholars apart, the greatest of the first emperor's crimes, as far as modern Chinese historians are concerned, was basically he had no regard for human life. The building of the road system, the building of the Great Wall of China, cost the lives of many thousands of people. We do not know exactly how many, but thousands. There's no doubt about that. The greatest loss of life, though, under the first emperor, was in the construction of his own tomb. What we learn from a later Chinese historian, Xian, who's the author of the Shiji, or the records of the grand historian, he's the grand historian, is that from the time he became king of Qin, at the age of 13, the first emperor was obsessed with the idea of building a tomb suitable for his eventual death and suitable for his afterlife. The construction of this tomb started when he was 13 years old. It was not completed until just before he died. According to Sima Qin, 700,000 workers died on that project. Well, that's probably got 1 0 too many. Probably nearer 70,000, but even so, that's an awful lot of people to die. The first emperor had an enormous fear of an early death. He was, well, to a certain extent, this was understandable. His mother's lover tried to have him assassinated. His half-brothers tried to have him killed. And so, you know, when you've got this type of thing going on in your family, you know, your own mother wants to have you dead. Okay. It's understandable that you might fear an early death yourself. So he spent a lot of time looking for what we call the elixir of life. The elixir of life is a mythical drink or substance that will give immortality to anybody who takes it. You will live forever. And from the moment he became king of Qin until the time he died, he employed doctors to look for the elixir of life. In 212, 2 of his doctors thought they had found it. They came up to him and said, "We've got the secret." So he says, "Bring me some old people who are clearly dying and let's see if it works." And of course it didn't work, did it? They died. The 2 doctors died. And 1,160 of the doctors in the same town were also executed as well, just to make certain nobody else tried to trick him about this. Well, on top of all the other things that the first emperor had done, his disregard for human life, many people really began to think that surely the gods are going to punish him in one way or another. And in fact, according to legend, in the year 211, 1 year later, a meteor fell in a village not far from Xian. And it was said that on that meteor came flashing through the sky a message from the gods. On the meteor, there were some signs that could be interpreted as saying, the first emperor will die and his empire will be divided. Well, when the first emperor heard about this, of course, he sent somebody out to investigate it. The officials saw what seemed to be these letters, and he said, "Who carved them on this meteor?" And nobody said they did it. Well, it was there when it arrives. So the village was executed, everybody in the village was executed, and a few others were buried alive just to make certain that they got the message. But in actual fact, the legend did come true. For the very next year, 210 BC, while he was travelling through eastern China, he did die after taking the newly invented elixir of life. Yes, a newly invented elixir of life. We can reconstruct what this probably was, because he started to go through periods of extreme anger and extreme depression. His skin colour changed. He seemed to be going slightly mad. And these are all things that we associate with mercury poisoning. Well, mercury, that silvery looking metal, is the only thing that dissolves gold. You may not have known that. And because it could dissolve gold, mercury was believed to have magical powers. It could preserve anything. So lots of attempts at making an elixir of life depended on mercury. But of course, if you take a regular diet of mercury every day, you die. You go mad, and then you die. And this is probably actually what happened to the first emperor of Qin. The body of the first emperor was now buried in his tomb at Xian, the one he started building when he was aged 13. And we have a description of the tomb as it was according to Sima Qian. Sima Qian tells us that the area was built, the area around the emperor's tomb was built as an imitation of the royal palace in Xian itself. In that area there were buried buildings which would serve as the offices for the emperor in the afterlife. There would be a wall, or there was a wall around the entire palace area. That there was an army of real soldiers, according to Sima Qian, buried there to defend the emperor and his tomb. The emperor himself was buried beneath a large barrow, a square barrow, and that in that square barrow, that tumulus, was a tomb chamber built like a plan of China. In that plan of China, set in the floor, were 100 rivers filled with mercury, according to Sima Qian. The room of the chamber was decorated with stars and moons and jewels and gold and things like that. The emperor was buried in a bronze sarcophagus. Sima Qian tells us also that the entrance to the tomb was protected with automatic weapons. Crossbows, ding! If anybody tried to get in there, Indiana Jones inspiration, of course, arrows would come and kill you on the way there. Then, according to Sima Qian, several of the senior officials of the period were buried alive with him and the army of living soldiers, plus servants and so forth and so forth. And then Sima Qian tells us the people who built the tomb were killed, so they couldn't tell anybody what it was like. So where does he get his story from? Well, who knows? Well, the story about this burial ground, of course, you could see for centuries afterwards some evidence of some basis of truth behind the story reported Sima Qian. For example, you could see the burial mound, the barrow over the first emperor's tomb. This is a massive structure. It now stands 46 meters tall, but originally it was closer to 70 meters. It's 515 by 450 meters around the base. This is a terrible photograph, air photograph, but you can just make out the actual barrow there. You can get some idea of the size of it from the roads around here. There's so much pollution. You can probably get a better view on Google, actually. There's so much pollution in that particular area. People did not dare dig into it, though, for fear of the mercury rivers, the automatic weapons. And the truth of the story reported by Sima Qian was basically thought, well, suspect, can't really be any truth in this at all, until 1974. Workmen, farmers in the area frequently dug large wells into the ground to find water. Often they would find terracotta figures of standing soldiers, which they would immediately smash into pieces and bury again, thinking that they might be ghosts. that might possibly come alive at night. But then one farmer in 1974 decided to actually report the discovery, hoping that he would get a reward, and so he did. This led to archaeologists to go into the site to start looking at there, to start making a systematic search of the area and excavation of the area. They were able to discover, using a magnetometer, an instrument for looking underneath the ground, that the farmer had found these figures in a very large pit, clearly an underground pit, with a series of at least 3 other pits around it. Pit 1 here, Pit 2, Pit 3 and Pit 4. These pits are 1.5 kilometers away from the actual burial mound of the emperor. But what they decided to do was to start excavating these, with Pit 1, the largest of the pits here. It's 230 meters long and 68 meters wide, and then slowly work their way through the rest. Well, this is what they found inside Pit 1. A series of terracotta models of soldiers, of horses, originally with wooden war chariots, sitting in corridors which have been dug to a depth of about 7 meters. So you've got these large corridors stretching from one end to the other. You can get some idea of the depth, 7 meters below the modern ground level. That was the ground level at the time the actual pit was excavated, at the time of the first emperor's death. These figures had originally stood in corridors cut into the ground with a wooden roof over them. Unfortunately, of course, the wooden roof, wood rots eventually, so the wooden roof had collapsed, smashing many of the figures, although in other cases the figures survived quite well. Pit 1 contained basically a Chinese army standing in formation, with something like 2,500 figures, I didn't write down the exact number down here, of men standing in battle formation. So you've got light infantry at the front of the army, you've got a series of war chariots just behind the light infantry, the main army behind them. Light infantry, these would be men who'd be armed with bows and arrows or throwing spears. The war chariots, made of wood. The wood, of course, is completely gone, but they're the chariot drivers still standing ready to ride their one-horse chariots, and then the heavy infantry behind them. When they went to look into Pit 2, a smaller pit with something like 1,400 figures, in this case mainly war chariots, and here you see some of the reconstructed war chariots based on the archaeological evidence actually found in Pit 2. Then the archaeologist, and a terrible slide there, a group of cavalry horses. Then at the front of Pit 2, what they found were larger figures than the rest, figures that were clearly meant to represent officers of the royal guard. There were archers standing at the ready, so this is the core part of the actual royal army in Pit 2. Pit 3 is the smallest of the lot. Pit 3, though, had contained a wooden enclosure like this. This is a restored view. It still had the remains of a bronze war chariot, the emperor's war chariot on one side, plus all his senior officers. Pit 4 was never finished. They hadn't quite got round to doing that one at the time the first emperor died. Well, altogether, Pits 1, 2 and 3 have got something like 8,000 terracotta soldiers and officers, 100 war chariots, 400 horses, 300 cavalry horses. Originally, all of the soldiers haven't been provided with weapons, actual weapons. In some cases, metal crossbows. But most of the weapons were of wood with a metal sharp bit at the end. So, for example, you've got this, which originally would have been on the end of a wooden pole 2 meters long. It's a combined spear and axe weapon. And you can see arrows as well, preserved there as well. What did become clear was that some of the pits, or part of the pit, had been broken into so that people could remove the weapons. Well, we know that after the first emperor died, there was a civil war, and then the Han dynasty took over. So this probably happened at that particular time. And you can see evidence up there of burning where the original wooden boards were burnt. All these figures were deliberately smashed, pretty certainly soon after the first emperor died, and all the weapons robbed away from them. All this discovery took place over here. The burial mound is over there. And it was decided in the year 2000 to do a proper archaeological survey of the entire area to see what else there might exist in this area. What they found was an enormous number of pits, unexcavated, still beneath the ground, which also contain figures of different types. What we have, for example, is just east outside the burial mound, one pit containing the emperor's day chariot, made entirely of bronze with terracotta horses. According to the grand historian, this is what he would use during the day. That's a back view of the same thing. And the one I really like, his sleeping chariot. So he can have a nice little sleep in the afternoon after having his lunch on his way from A to B. Some of the pits contain models of what are clearly court officials. People with very elaborate dress like this, life-size figures, different hairstyles, different moustaches, different beards, clearly representing court officials. Now remember what we're told by the grand historian, Xian, that the first emperor was buried with a living army and with living court officials as well. Well, we can see that actually that's why the origin of this story is terracotta figures like that. Another pit contains life-size models of acrobats, wrestlers, and other entertainers, including musicians. The wooden instrument is unfortunately gone, but we still have the player there herself. We even have dancing girls. So when you read about the terracotta army, this is what you think automatically, the terracotta armor, all these soldiers, but actually the whole site at Xian is full of pits with terracotta figures who would supply everything that the first emperor needed in the afterlife. The figures themselves, all of the figures, when they were originally made and buried, were very brightly painted. And you can see here one of the soldier figures under excavation, and you can see the bright paint on that. And it's been possible to make copies and reconstruct the appearance of some of these figures as we have here. We can analyze the paint traces and get some idea what they actually look like. Very detailed figures, as you can see, the details of their armor, absolutely fantastic. The figures themselves are actually really quite tall. You might think automatically of people in China being 170 meters, possibly. These figures are all 183, which is my height, up to about 193. So these are taller than life size. What's really astounding about them is, now bear in mind, there are over 8,000 soldiers have been identified in these pits. And what is quite clear from analysis is that all these soldiers are made from a series of standard moulds. There are 8 moulds for faces and something like 40 moulds for different parts of the armour, the body, the arms and the legs. But when you look at the faces of these 8,000 soldiers, each one is different. Although there's only 8 or so basic moulds for the face, the people making these were careful enough to bring together different details from one mould to another. So you've got differences in hairstyle, differences in ear size, differences in nose shape, differences in moustache style. And so you will hear it said, and you can read it, that no figure is exactly identical. Well, is that true or not? To a certain extent, yes. I mean, if you look at these two, you can see there is a difference, a very slight difference. It is very slight. It's just basically in the moustache there. It's an amazing piece of production work, though. And what we have to take into account here is that the first emperor starts building this when he's 13 years old, when he's just a king of Qin. When he becomes first emperor, he can use all the country's resources to help build this marvelous burial ground. So all the state industry is devoted to doing this. You can see now another reason why modern Chinese historians don't really like the first emperor that much. All the resources of the state are being dedicated on building his tomb, which means that the economy to a certain extent goes downhill, and despite the Great Wall of China, the organisation of an amazing army, China really didn't do that particularly well under the first emperor's rule. Well, work is still going on at Xian to look at some more of the pits. The problem is, of course, it would be lovely to have each one of these pits actually excavated, but what you have to bear in mind here is the problems of restoration. All the figures were in pits in the ground with wooden roofs over them. When the wooden roof fell in, the earth fell in on top, smashing the figures like this. The enormous job of restoring all of these takes forever. And as you can see here, this is exactly the same chamber we're looking at, 38, 39, 37, the next one over. So it's very unlikely that each one of these pits will actually be excavated. Well, what about the barrow? What about the burial mound? This is quite interesting. Well, the burial mound is 46 meters high. That's a major job of excavation. Burial mounds can often seal perfectly all sorts of materials inside them, organic materials. Archaeology doesn't stop when we find something. We have to restore it, we have to maintain it, we have to conserve it. So if the burial mound was excavated, who knows what you might find inside it? Silks, you've got to preserve them. Wooden furniture, you've got to preserve that. It would cost millions and millions and millions. Well, of dollars, not Turkish lira, of dollars. The other thing is, though, about the burial mound, it's very unlikely that we'll ever see it excavated. But the Chinese authorities have done a series of tests on the burial mound. Using ground-penetrating radar, they've identified a chamber in the burial mound, which is 80 meters long and 50 meters wide, and possibly 15 meters high. They can't be certain. But there's something there. There is a very large room, burial chamber, in that mound. Something like 80 meters long, 50 meters wide, size of a football field, an American football field. Well, you can easily imagine how somebody can have a map of China built into that. The other interesting thing is they've done 4,000 test drills into the mound, not into the chamber, but just into the mound, to analyse what the soil is like. The story is, of course, that he's buried with a map of China and rivers of mercury. And what they found in these 4,000 test bores are levels of mercury in the soil 100 times higher than what you would find in the ground naturally. So it does look as if there might actually be some truth in this story given to us by the grand historian. Whether or not the automatic crossbows still work, that's another question. The weapons that were buried in the burial pits were treated with a type of chrome, nice shiny silver chrome, which means that they are incredibly well preserved. Some of the crossbows found in the burial pits were metal. It's quite possible that, yes, the automatic crossbows are there waiting for somebody to go walking into the tunnels, and then they're dead. There we are. All right. Now, presentations. I have had